Hi everybody, once again, we're going to try doing this video learning thing. So today we're going to be talking about the cell cycle and cancer. And I hope you remember this diagram right here. Okay, this is our cell cycle. So let's just take a look at it one last time. All right, so once again, all of this is interphase. Okay, so interphase. Okay, and then we've got mitosis, so this is my PMAT, where the nucleus divides. And the last little bit, cytokinesis, where we have the actual physical cell dividing. Okay, so we end up with our two daughter cells. Two daughter cells, okay, that are identical to the parent cell. All right. So once again, looking at interphase, we've got three parts to it. It's our growth stage. So originally, our organelles. So the organelles are duplicated, right? Doubled. Okay, and the cell gets bigger. Then in S phase, my DNA is synthesized, so my DNA is duplicated. So at this point, we have 96 chromosomes. Okay. And lastly, this is where my editing phase is in G2, okay, to make sure that every one of those chromosomes that was doubled is actually correct, because there's no sense in splitting a mistake that may end up dying, so don't even waste the energy, okay? So once again, interphase, where everything doubles and the cell grows in size. Mitosis, where the nucleus divides. Cytokinesis, where actually the cells divide. So you end up with two cells. Okay? So that's what we're talking about there. So taking a look, I'm just going to scooch this up. Okay. During interphase, the cell needs a lot of energy for cellular respiration, and what ends up happening, like I said before, is the cell that's going to be divided needs to grow. But these cells cannot get too big, because if they get too big, it becomes inefficient. So if the cell gets too big, it's inefficient. And what I mean by that is that it's going to take too much time to get nutrients into the cell, to get waste out of the cell, and in the process, the cell could die because it's not getting, for the lack of a better word, fed properly, or toxins can build up. Okay, so that's why the cell, we can't just be one walking cell either, right? Because that's inefficient. So that's why we have to have our cells dividing. They produce smaller cells, and those cells grow. Okay, now here's one thing that you may not have thought about. When our parent cells divide to daughter cells, at what point do those cells do something? Okay, because as you also know, I mean, inherently, that all of the cells in our body, they're not all the same cell. They have the same DNA in them, but they're not doing the same thing. Like I keep always saying, a heart cell, a kidney cell, a hair cell, an eye cell, all of those cells do different things. And even though genetically they look the same, those genes, and remember, genes code for proteins. So we've got here genes and proteins, right? And those proteins have functions that are specialized, okay? All right, and that is what separates an eye cell from a hair cell, from a liver cell, from a lung cell. It's the genes are all the same, but we activate. Ooh, it went through two. Okay, so we activate certain genes to make specific proteins, and then once those proteins are activated, we get specific functions. Okay, and this occurs. You did this thing that's underlined, and now that I'm circling. Cell specialization. Okay, so when I say cell specialization, I'm saying you've got a function as a cell. You're not just a random, like, universal cell. you've been given a path. And so the analogy I always use, and I'm sad that I'm not getting to use this in front of your faces, but up until this point, and I think I said this the first day we met, you haven't had a choice, right? Up until grade 10, you haven't had a choice in what you're doing for your education, right? Like, yes, you could have chosen academic or applied, but for the most part, you didn't have a choice in taking science. Next year, you get to specialize. You get to choose a path, just like the cell. The cell grew, and then it starts to choose a path. Is it going to be an eye cell? Is it going to be a heart cell? And that's because certain proteins were made because the genes were turned on. And then because those proteins were made, then that cell became and had a certain function. Now, because these cells specialize and they have different functions, they also have different lifespans. And normally I would play a game, guess which cell is alive for the longest, which cell would be, have the shortest lifespan. But we don't have time for games anymore, boys and girls. So we're going to go straight to the chart here. As you can see, your intestine cell lives the shortest lifespan. And that makes sense because think about, not the intestine, the stomach cell. And that makes sense because think about the environment of the stomach. It's got acid in there to digest your food, right? So the stomach cells aren't going to make it too long because they're constantly being bathed in hydrochloric acid. So they're only sticking around for 2 days. The brain cell, however, has a really long lifespan. And here's my public service announcement for the day. This is why you don't do drugs. Because if you kill the brain cells by doing drugs, your brain cells do not regenerate themselves that often. So once a brain cell is gone, it's not likely being replaced. So as you kill more and more brain cells, you have fewer and fewer brain cells. Not like your skin cell, and this is why we exfoliate. And this is usually why suntans only last for 20 days, right? 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, you start losing your color. In fact, I'm getting pretty pale these days, kids. So skin cells are only around for 20 days. This is why we exfoliate. We get rid of the dead skin cells because they're constantly needing to be replaced. Brain cells, not so much. Red blood cells, 120 days. So what is that, around 4 months? That's why you can only donate blood in a certain amount of time because you need to give your body time to replenish that blood cell. So take home message from this is cells can be specialized to do a specific function. And depending on that function, those cells live for different times. So meaning the cell, meaning the cell cycle is a different amount of time. So that circle that we were talking about before is a different time frame. Okay, so, but they also have finite lifespans, meaning they can't live forever. All right, so for your body to function, the process of cell division must be controlled, meaning we can't let that cycle, and I'm just going to scooch right back down, we can't let this cycle, this one right here, go on and on and on and on because you'd end up with too many cells. All right, so it is controlled. I'm going to go right back down here. All right, so in order to control them, there's 3 checkpoints. So think of them like border crossings, okay? We got a checkpoint here, a checkpoint here, and a checkpoint here, okay? And once again, it's to control things, to make sure everything's going and doing as it should, all right? So if we take a look, these checkpoints ensure that the cell cycle continues when it needs more cells, or it stops or pauses when you don't need more cells, okay? And those situations, we've already kind of talked about. There's 3 stop signals, the red, 1, 2, 3. Those signals will stop the cell cycle if, number 1, there's not enough nutrients to support cell division. So if you're starving, your body's not going to make more cells because that's a waste of resources. If there's a problem with the DNA, either you didn't double it completely, or the DNA in the cell is damaged, or there was some kind of mutation. There's no point in dividing or replicating or making more cells if there's a mistake. Okay, here's a good video for you to watch. And then this is pretty much what I just said. So I'm going to scooch up. Now, when we talk about the cell cycle checkpoints, a lot of things can affect those checkpoints. So one of the main things is improper DNA replication or damaged DNA. And ways you can damage DNA are these things called carcinogens. And this is an important word. Okay, so a carcinogen is something, some environmental substance or something in our world that can cause damage to DNA. And usually we equate them to things that cause cancer. All right. So if the damage to the DNA is really bad, then we know that cell won't make it. So the cell will cut its losses or the body will cut its losses and kill that cell before it goes out into the world and replicates, because you don't want damaged or incorrect DNA to keep going through the cell cycle and then keep replicating a wrong genetic sequence. Okay? So if that damage is unfixable, what the cell will do is the cell will commit cell suicide. And that word for cell suicide is, and I like saying the word even though it's kind of a sad word, apoptosis. Okay, so cell suicide, it's programmed cell death. Okay, and yeah, so programmed cell death. Okay, however, sometimes mistakes go through, and then we've got problems because the cells, like programmed cell death, didn't work, and mistakes are allowed to replicate. And in that case, we've got what we know as cancer. So some cells contain mutations that ignore stop signs in the cell signal, or cell cycle. So it keeps going even when it really should stop. All right? And think about it. We know the word tumor, but what a tumor is a mass of cells. All right? So a tumor is a mass of cells. It's a bunch of cells that just keep piling on top of each other. Okay? And they're allowed to keep growing because the cell cycle keeps going, right? And so that's what a tumor is, an abnormal clump of cells formed when cells divide repeatedly. So you can have two types of tumor. The benign tumor, and that benign tumor stays in one place. It has not moved, okay? And then you've got what's called the malignant tumor, and that malignant tumor is able to spread because it's gone into the bloodstream. Okay, so then it's carried, those cells are carried by the blood, and then, so you may have heard, and I hope you have never heard this word, but you may have, metastasized. The tumor is metastasized. That's when it means it's moved, and it's usually moved into a different organ because it traveled through the bloodstream. Okay, so I'm going to move on up, and there's the definition for metastases. Okay, so it's moved, and here's a picture of exactly what I just described. Okay, so you've got your normal lung cells. See, they're nice and purple here. Okay, and then you've got a cell that dies, and so there's a space, so that cell can divide, and now these are daughter cells. Okay, and say for instance, we've got a situation where those new daughter cells, these guys, something was wrong with the DNA. We're going to have a situation that I'm just going to describe right now. All right, so I'm going to move this up. So, and we've got both pictures on there now. So cancer cells, just like I said before, they have a genetic mistake. Okay, so they're abnormal. They divide uncontrollably, so that cell cycle just keeps going around and around and around and around. And those cells that have the mistake, they're genetically abnormal, spread to other body parts, and then they just keep growing and growing. So it's like a parasite, okay? It takes over, all right? So they do not respond to the cell cycle control mechanisms because the cell cycle never stops. So they just keep on dividing even when they're not attached to a surface. And then the cell cycle actually just like goes into overdrive. And like I said before, like a tumor, these cells can pile up. Normal cells don't like to touch each other. So if they can feel like they don't like getting into any other cell's space, but cancer cells, it's like those close talkers. You know, if you've ever seen that Seinfeld episode, The Close Talker, cancer cells get right up in everybody's business and they just keep growing. Okay? So if you think about it, let's compare this picture to this picture. So we've got the purple lung cells. This is where we've got our mutated cell. Now this mutated cell just keeps, and see how the normal lung cells, they're nice and ordered, the purple guys, and this guy just keeps piling up right here. Now the tumor starts, remember that's a mass of cells, and then the problem, so right now this one's benign. And I think I spelled benign wrong, but don't worry about that. Okay, this one's benign. Now, as soon as that benign tumor invades our bloodstream, that's when it metastasizes, right? And then it's capable of going to other organs, okay? So then, here is a cross, or just like a table compare and contrast between normal cells and cancer cells. I'll let you read that, okay? But the main thing is that these cancer cells don't specialize. So normally, a normal cell will become an eye cell, a lung cell, a heart cell, a whatever cell. Cancer cells, they're so greedy, they don't waste any energy becoming something. They are just cancer, and then they just suck the life out of anything that's around it. And that's why people get sick from cancer. And some people die because those cancer cells, once they take over, they're taking over all the energy from everything else. Okay, so here's another good video for you to watch. Now, causes of cancer. Sometimes your genetic history, you can inherit a gene through mom or dad, and those genes make proteins that may cause cancers. So that's why in some cases people do a genetic test to see if they've got a predisposition for a certain type of cancer. Okay, so for example, Angelina Jolie had the gene for a certain type of breast cancer. She got the test, she knew, and then in the end she had surgery to remove her breasts to prevent her from getting breast cancer. Okay, so that's one thing. So she had a familial link to a certain type of cancer. So that's what we're talking about here. Some cancers are caused by those carcinogens, which, remember, the carcinogen causes the mutation of DNA. So for instance, and these are environmental factors. So you weren't born with them, you were exposed to them through your environment. Okay, so you've heard about this, tobacco smoke. So people who smoke, when you're inhaling the smoke, the toxins in the cigarette smoke or vaping, don't think it's just cigarettes. You guys know what I'm talking about. Any kind of inhalation of any kind of product can damage the DNA in your lungs. Okay? X-rays, and this is why we put those lead shields on when we go to the dentist, because X-rays can damage DNA. Air pollution, same kind of thing with the tobacco smoke. So smog can also mutate DNA. And UV radiation, this is like if you're getting a sun and you're not wearing sunscreen and you get a bad burn, that UV light from the sun can actually break apart your double helix in your DNA, and that can cause damage to the permanent damage to your DNA. So that's why some people get moles or even freckles. Not that freckles are cancerous, but they can turn into things because they're highly pigmented. Okay, so here is a graphic, and it kind of indicates the causes of preventable types of cancer. So these are carcinogens. Okay, so a lot of times tobacco, excess weight and obesity, certain things in diet. Did you know charred food? So if you barbecue and you eat the black charring, that's a carcinogen. Okay. Occupation. So sometimes you're doing dangerous jobs. I know I can speak about my own grandfather who used to work in the coke ovens at Stelco. So if you're being constantly surrounded by black particles, that's just like smoking. Okay. And those occupations are at a higher risk of developing certain types of respiratory cancers because they're breathing in a lot of particulate. Okay. Family history. So that's the genetics. Alcohol is a carcinogen because it can cause damage. It's toxin. Okay. UV and ionizing radiation, that's the sun. Certain drugs. And then a lot of times we just don't know. Okay. So cancer prevention. People can reduce the risk of cancer by following 5 steps. Okay. Do not quit. Do not smoke. Oh my gosh, I read that wrong. I thought I made a typo. Do not quit is what I thought I wrote. But yes, do not smoke or quit smoking or vaping. That is number 1. Because I'm hoping that none of you vape. Most of you aren't going to be smoking cigarettes. But people think vaping's okay, and it's no different. In fact, we don't know how bad vaping is because we have not studied it long enough. Okay? You're going to prevent ultra sun exposure. So you're going to wear your sunscreen. You're going to be covered. You're not going to be, basting yourself in oil and trying to get a super tan. You are going to constantly look at your body for moles and changes in skin pigment. You are going to lead a healthy lifestyle by exercising and eating a rainbow colored diet. Okay, because, and we've talked about these, antioxidants. Okay, because they prevent the oxidation of your DNA. All right, and here's another good video for you to watch and another graphic. If we take a look here, how we diagnose cancer. All right, so there's a couple of different diagnosing tools. So x-rays, they can actually see through the bone and see if there's anything growing on bone. Okay, MRIs, PET scans, and mammograms. These are things that we oftentimes, and we're going to look at this a little bit more in depth, so actually I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them. But those are ways, the initial ways of diagnosing whether or not there is a tumor. And then they go into a little more detail. Okay, so once you've had these tests, then sometimes if they see a tumor, they will do a biopsy, and that's pretty much cutting out a section of where they think they found a tumor and testing to see whether the DNA has been mutated. Okay, and so a lot of times they will test that tumor and then determine, has the DNA been mutated? And if so, is it a known cancer marker? And then if they found through that biopsy that that tumor is cancerous, they can do a couple of different therapies: radiation, chemotherapy, and surgery. So we'll start with the least sophisticated, which is surgery, where they're just going to physically remove the tumor. Okay, they're going to cut it out. And that way, if you detect it early, they can just cut it out, and it's painful, but you're not being subjected to chemotherapy or radiation therapy. So a lot of times, this is the first thing that you can do. Then, chemotherapy uses chemicals. That's why they call it chemo. Okay, and it stops the cancer cells from dividing, because don't forget, cancer cells are constantly dividing. It's the cell cycle out of control, right? So it just keeps going around and around and around and around. Now, when people have chemotherapy, oftentimes they lose their hair. And the reason they lose their hair is because the chemicals that chemotherapy uses targets fast-growing cells. And what is always growing on you? Your hair. And so that is one of the side effects of chemotherapy. Okay? Then, radiation therapy is ionizing energy. So a lot of times it's a laser that is directed at, like, directly at where the tumor is. So it's like think of it like a directed missile towards that tumor. Okay? So sometimes people, like, it's good because it'll pinpoint target the tumor, but it also damages healthy cells near the tumor. You can get radiation burns and things like that. So those are our cancer treatments that we have right now. And here's also another video for you to watch. Now, here are our practice questions. Homework. Okay. There's also an LMS quiz. If there's any issues, you can send me questions in the discussion box under class tools. Let me know if this was helpful. I will talk to you guys soon. Take care of yourselves. I miss you. Bye, everyone.